In this tutorial, you'll be learning how to take off and land on very short mountain airstrips with tall trees nearby. It's very important to use the flaps during short takeoffs and landings. Flaps serve two purposes. They generate more lift, and they cause drag, which slows the plane down. Before taking off, you should extend the flaps one notch by pressing the F7 key. If you want to watch how the flaps change the look of your wing, you can switch to spot view by pressing the F11 key. Press F9 to return to virtual cockpit view. Try to take off when you reach 55 knots and climb out at 60 knots, which will give you the best angle of climb in this aircraft. Pull back now to lift off. Great takeoff! Now that you're in the air, retract the flaps by pressing the F6 key. Your landing spot will be the Lower Loon airstrip to the south of your present position. It's very short and surrounded by hills, so it will be difficult to land on if you approach the runway from the wrong direction. The best route to the Lower Loon is to follow the river valley rather than flying straight over the hills. This will allow for a shallower approach for landing. You can follow the waypoint markers if you want. We're about halfway to Lower Loon. This might be a good time to go over some bush flying tips. In real bush flying, you should always overfly the runway before landing to check the runway condition and to look for obstacles which could contribute to an unsafe landing. Even in Flight Simulator, it's a good idea to inspect a landing site before committing. Many of the mountain strips in this area are one-way in, one-way out approaches, and you only get one chance at the landing with no possibility of a go-around. If you need to turn around within the confines of a valley or a canyon, you can perform a canyon turn by slowing the aircraft down and dropping the flaps. With this technique, you can minimize your turn radius as long as you keep the power up and stay above stall speed. As you approach Lower Loon, start slowing down early in preparation to land, or to execute a canyon turn if you need to turn around. Now that you're getting close to the airport, maintain 55 knots and fully extend the flaps by pressing the F8 key. Remember to increase power to compensate for the increased drag, or you might stall. When approaching at more than 60 knots, you might not be able to stop before you reach the trees at the end of the runway. Go around and try it again. Great landing.
This flight is just a quick 35-mile repositioning from Edinburgh to Glasgow without any passengers on board. A good opportunity to get you checked out on the Bombardier CRJ 700. While we're waiting in line for takeoff, I'll explain a few things. Flying a modern jet isn't really all that different from flying a small prop plane. There are just a handful of key differences. The first thing you'll notice is how different the instrument panel looks. Instead of many small, round mechanical instruments, there are just a few large computer screens. Most of the information is the same, but the presentation is different.
World Travel 221, full short runway 6 right, traffic at the 707 final.
Holding short, 6 right, World Travel 221.
That call was for another aircraft. We're Orbit 526. I'll handle the radios during this flight, so don't worry if you miss anything. I'll tell you what to do. The display on the left is the primary flight display, or PFD. It combines multiple instruments into one display. The blue and brown section in the middle of the PFD is an attitude indicator. The vertical tape on the left side shows airspeed, and the tape on the right side shows altitude. At the bottom in the middle is a horizontal situation indicator, which shows heading, and to the right of that is a vertical speed indicator. Glass displays like these take some time to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, you'll love them. The display to the right of the PFD is the navigation display, which shows a top-down view of the aircraft's position relative to navigational aids and the flight planned route. You can change how the map looks by using the format and range knobs on the left side of the panel. Try it now if you want to. Okay, the third display is the Engine Indication and Crew Alerting System, or ICAS. The default page shows engine information, gear and flap positions, fuel quantity, and warning and caution messages. You can scroll through the different ICAS screens by clicking the up and down buttons at the bottom of the display. Each screen provides information about a different aircraft system. For this flight, keep the engine gauges showing on the ICAS. The top gauges are labeled N1. As we fly, I'll give you suggested thrust settings. Use your joystick throttle lever or the F2 and F3 keys to move the N1 needles to the settings I suggest. The rows of buttons and knobs just below the windshield is the mode control panel for the autopilot. We won't be using the autopilot on this flight, so don't worry about any of that for now. A big difference between jets and piston aircraft is that in a jet, the engines take a while to spool up. This means that if you add or reduce thrust, there will be a slight delay before your action has any effect. This fact, combined with the jet's higher speed, means that you need to plan ahead.
World Travel 221, back into position and hold.
Position and hold, World Travel 221.
Jets have flaps just like piston aircraft. They're used during takeoff and landing to increase both lift and drag. Lower the flaps to 20 degrees for takeoff now by pressing the F7 key 3 times. You can see the flap indicator on the ICAS. Good. Stop here.
Orbit 526, full short, runway 6 right.
One last thing. During the takeoff roll, I'll call out 4 speeds. When I call 80 knots, glance at your airspeed tape to verify it's moving and indicating approximately the same speed as mine. When I call V1, it means we're at the speed where we're committed to taking off because there isn't enough runway to stop at that point. When I say rotate, gently pull back on the stick and rotate the nose into the air. Finally, I'll call V2 when we reach the minimum safety speed at which we can safely climb on just one engine if there's a failure. We'll hold short 6 right, orbit 526.
World Travel 221, winds calm, clear to take off.
Okay, follow the 737 ahead of us, but hold short of the runway. Release the brakes by pressing the period key and apply some thrust to get us going.
World Travel 221, rolling.
Orbit 526, back into position and hold.
Position and hold, orbit 526. Okay, we're cleared to taxi onto the runway, but not to take off yet. Taxi ahead and turn right onto the runway. Stop once you're on the runway and lined up with the center line. Press Shift 5 to display the overhead panel and turn on the landing light by clicking the switch in the lower left corner. Then press Shift 5 again to close the overhead. Before we take off, let's review exactly what will happen. You'll control the aircraft, I'll handle the radios. I'll call out 80 knots, V1, rotate, and V2. When I say rotate, gently pull back on the stick to raise the nose to 15 degrees nose up on the primary flight display. I'll tell you to retract the landing gear once we're climbing. Once we reach 1,000 feet above the runway, I'll tell you to pitch down to 10 degrees nose up and to raise the flaps so we can accelerate. Our initial climb will be to our cruise altitude of 6,000 feet, and the departure controller will probably tell us to make a left turn to the west. I'll let you know when to turn.
Orbit 526, winds are calm, runway 6 right, clear for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff, orbit 526. All right, we're cleared to go. When you're ready, use the throttle lever on your joystick or press the F3 key to add thrust. Start with 50% N1. Let the engine stabilize and then increase thrust to 100%. 80 knots. V1. Rotate. Slowly pitch up to 15 degrees. V2. Positive rate, gear up. Raise the landing gear by pressing the G key.
Orbit 526, contact departure.
Orbit 526, switching. Okay, move the stick to adjust pitch to 10 degrees nose up on the primary flight display, and raise the flaps. Reduce thrust to about 80% N1 to keep our speed below 250 knots. Climb and maintain 6,000 feet. Edinburgh departure, Orbit 526 with you, climbing to 6,000.
Orbit 526, roger. Orbit 526, turn left heading 270.
Left to 270, Orbit 526. Okay, it's time for the turn. Make a nice easy left turn until our heading is 270 degrees. That's due west. Level off at 6,000 feet and reduce thrust to about 60% N1. That should give us about 250 knots. Let's run through the after takeoff checklist. Landing gear, up. We'll stay low on this short flight, so don't exceed 250 knots and keep the landing lights on. This is standard practice below 10,000 feet. Flaps, up.
Orbit 526, resume own navigation.
Don't exceed 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Thrust set to 80% N1 for the climb. After takeoff checklist complete. Resume own navigation, Orbit 526. All right, we've been told to resume our own navigation. This means the controller will no longer be giving us vectors, and we should follow our filed flight plan. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. Our flight plan route takes us to a point that will line us up for an approach to Glasgow's runway 23, which is currently the active runway. You can use the mission compass to navigate to that point, or you can follow our flight plan on the map page of the navigation display. The pink line on the screen is the path we should be following. assigned altitude. Climb to 6,000 feet.
Orbit 526. Contact Glasgow approach on 119.1.
Orbit 526 switching. Thanks. Glasgow approach. Orbit 526 with you.
Orbit 526, Glasgow approach. Good morning. Reduce speed to 210 knots. Expect vectors for the visual approach. Runway 23 at Glasgow. Glasgow altimeter 29902.
Slowing to 210 and we'll expect the visual for runway 23. Orbit 526. Bring the thrust back to about 50% N1, then adjust it to maintain 210 knots. Since the weather's good, the controller will line us up with the runway and give us clearance to proceed to the airport visually once we have the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, descend and maintain 3000.
Descend and maintain 3,000, orbit 526. Okay, we've got clearance to descend to 3,000 feet. Reduce thrust to idle and gently push forward on the stick to take us down. Pitch to about 7 degrees nose down to maintain 210 knots as we descend. Okay, level off here at 3,000 feet and bring the thrust back up to about 50% N1 to maintain 210 knots.
Orbit 526, reduce speed to 180 knots.
Slowing to 180, orbit 526. Okay, now reduce thrust a bit to slow to 180 knots. Pull back on the stick a bit to keep the nose from dropping. Maintain 3,000 feet as you slow down. Press F7 twice to lower the flaps to 8 degrees. The flaps will slow us down, so bring the thrust back up to about 60% N1 so we maintain 180 knots.
Sink rate. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up. Sink rate. Pull up. Sink rate. Sink rate. Pull up. Pull up. Sink rate.
You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick.
Pull up. Pull up. Sink rate. Sink rate. Sink rate. Sink rate. Sink rate. Sink rate. Too low. Too low. Too low. Too low. Sink rate.
You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. You're over-control.